say, is it not true only women can bear children? She goes, no, that's not true. She goes, well, there is some Japanese tribe off some Japanese island where within their mythological folkloric realm, it is the men who bear children. If you're too empathetic, we need to let in everybody into the United States because everybody deserves an equal opportunity to flourish in the US. Is it not true since time immemorial that sailors have relied that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? So then she says to me, what do you mean by east and west? And what do you mean by the sun? That which you call the sun, I might call dancing hyena.
The first thing I want to talk to you, Doctor, and I want to start by admitting something. One of my biggest weaknesses, and we always made fun of it in my team, is I'm extremely empathetic. Okay. So your interview with the gentleman we're talking about, the CEO, Diary of CEO, and that interview was different to others because it really went into personal topics.
Yes.
Men, families, relationships. And that was a really difficult one for me to consume. It went pretty deep. Now, when my team criticized me and I criticized myself for being too empathetic, I've got so many examples in my life where I just go overboard to someone that's been harming me.
Yes.
I kind of laughed it off. But, as I consumed your content, I started realizing that empathy could end up being very dangerous.
Yes.
I think it's something you've articulated in such an extremely good way. You've seen me and Elon and others engage with your content so often. So you've been very good at articulating it, especially for the average person to understand. The first question I have for you is the dangers or the other side of empathy. Like, where should one be concerned and empathy could go too far?
Right. First, great to be with you, Mario. Nice
Pleasure.
to meet you in person. We've done one remotely on my show, so it's great to do it in person. Look, the ancient Greeks had a very important maxim, and it was everything in moderation, right? Aristotle said that. It's called the golden mean. Too little of something is not good. Too much of something is not good. And you have to find the sweet spot. My latest book, the happiness book, I demonstrate that so much of our lives are ruled by this inverted U. Too little, not good. Too much, not good. It's good in the middle. In the case of Aristotle, he basically argued that, look, if you take a soldier who is very cowardly, it's not good. If you take a soldier who's excessive in his brazen courage, it's not good because he's going to die very quickly. It's somewhere in the middle. So now we applied that exact principle to empathy. Too little empathy or no empathy, and you're a psychopath. I mean, it is literally the definition that psychopaths don't have any empathy. For example, psychopaths, many of them in their childhood will exhibit great cruelty towards animals. They torture them. And then if you ask them, well, what did you feel? It's as if you're speaking a different language. They don't understand what you're saying. Well, what do you mean? I felt nothing. I was just torturing the animal. So too little empathy is not good. But to your point, too much empathy is also not good. At the individual level, it's not good, right? Because you end up being paralyzed by being empathetic in all sorts of situations where you shouldn't be. But at the societal level, it's really not good. Hence the topic of my next book, Suicidal Empathy, where empathy misfires. And let me explain what I mean by that. Take, for example, obsessive compulsive disorder, right? It makes perfect evolutionary sense for us to scan the world for environmental threats. So if you, for example, come in today, you sneeze into your hand, and then you come out to shake my hand, I'm going to say, excuse me, Mario, I want to go to the bathroom just to wash my hands, right? That makes perfect sense. If, on the other hand, that mechanism misfires, becomes hyperactive, such that every morning I end up spending 6 hours washing my hands with scalding hot water so that my skin is starting to fall off and I can't make it to my job, then it becomes OCD. So in OCD, when the behavior is regulated within certain normal ranges, it makes adaptive sense. But when it misfires, it becomes hyperactive. It becomes a psychiatric disorder, OCD. The exact same principle applies for empathy. If you're too empathetic, we need to let in everybody into the United States because everybody deserves an equal opportunity to flourish in the US. That's not how life works, right? I am someone who is quite well known. When I had to go and get a job in Michigan this year now, where I'm a visiting professor, I had to go through a rigorous set of paperwork in order for me to enter legally into the United States. But suicidal empathy says, no, no, no. Anybody who wants to come in and participate in the American experiment should be allowed to be let in, even if that causes great domestic harm. So what the book talks about is what happens to our public policy decisions when empathy goes awry.
Right. So you've made a few points. One of the points you've made is where too much empathy is bad to the person that's being too empathetic. That one is easier to understand. But you also said how it's bad to a society. Now, and use the example of immigration. It's one that's, again, easy to understand, because when you make it easy for anyone to enter the country, then the people trying to do it the right way, it feels very unfair to them. And then they're incentivized to break the law. Like, hey, why do I need to follow the law? And that applies to any law. But a question I have is it bad for society as a whole? So it's bad for the US. And to be honest, I'm obviously very critical of the current lack of enforcement for immigration laws in the States. But is it bad for the rest of the world? Is it bad for those in need trying to get into the country?
Again, life is about finding the sweet spot, right? So let me draw another analogy in evolutionary science, which is my area of scientific research. It makes perfect sense for me to have evolved the instinct to jump in front of a truck to save my children, but I would be less likely to jump in front of a truck to save random children that I don't know. That doesn't make me evil and callous. It makes me someone who has evolved the emotional and cognitive system that recognizes that I don't met out my investments indiscriminately to everyone, right? It doesn't make me a bad person. It makes me a Darwinian being. So, for example, I've done research where I've studied how do we allocate our gift-giving budgets in a given year. Not surprisingly, we do it in a very strategic way. I'm much more likely to give a larger gift to people with whom I share a lot of genes than to my second cousin, meaning that my emotional system has evolved to be consistent with some of these evolutionary benefits that are reaped in me investing in different types of people. So yes, it's nice to be empathetic, but I can't be indiscriminately empathetic to everyone. And it can't be that it misfires such that the Guatemalan illegal immigrant is more important than the American vet.
That's an extreme. I think that's like the peak of how far it could misfire. Can it get worse than this? Like, we're seeing how crazy things have become in the US, and Canada's even worse.
Yes.
Can you give us historical examples where it got even worse than this?
In a suicidal empathy kind of way?
Correct.
Well, I would say that this is probably the apex of insanity.
Okay.
The two books that speak about this. The Parasitic Mind was about what happens to a human brain when its ability to think is parasitized. Suicidal empathy completes that story by saying what happens to the human brain when its emotional system is parasitized. And I can't think of a situation where a society has been more keen on committing orgiastic suicide in the pursuit of infinite tolerance and kindness.
Orgiastic suicide. That was clicked in me. It's stuck in my mind for a while. So essentially, it's like a society goes too far where it's like killing itself from within by just being too empathetic. And then that's linked to the whole concept of a parasitic mind, which I'd like you to explain that as well for the audience, so anyone that hasn't heard your content previously, and how that links, how the parasitic mind links to suicidal empathy. And then what we'll do is we'll kind of bring it to current events, because there's a few of them.
So let's do parasitic mind. So I started my career, I became a professor in 1994. I've been a professor for longer than you've been alive. Is that true?
Almost, no.
Oh my God, I'm old. Okay, anyways, so in 1994, I began as a professor, and my original goal, which I pursued throughout my career, was to try to apply evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to study human behavior, specifically consumer and economic decision-making. How do our hormones affect our behaviors, right? How does testosterone affect our behavior? How does the menstrual cycle affect how a woman dresses across the menstrual cycle? So I look at the biological drivers of why we behave the way that we do. I very quickly noticed, Mario, that most of my social science colleagues were dead set against what I was doing, because to them, what made us human is that we transcended our biology. Biology was important to explain the behavior of the mosquito and your dog and the zebra, But surely, according to them, biology doesn't apply to human behavior. We are a cultural animal. And so that's when I first started realizing that even very intelligent and educated people can be completely parasitized by bullshit. Yeah. Okay. And so how could it be? I mean, it should be rather non-controversial to say that human beings are affected by their biology.
But what I don't understand, Doctor, and what I struggle to understand, I literally called Jess who helped us organize this, and just kind of, I said, Jess, there's always a middle ground between two sides of any argument. But why are other intelligent professors, other colleagues of yours, not understanding this basic fact that should be very basic for anyone else?
Right, exactly. Well, and hence that's why I wrote The Parasitic Mind.
Okay.
So let's start with why people have such biophobia. Biophobia means fear of using biology to explain human behavior.
Biophobia.
Yeah. And so there are several reasons for that, and I've gone through it in one of my earlier books, in The Consuming Instinct. It's very hopeful to think that we are only a socially constructed animal. So, and let me explain what I mean by that. It makes a parent feel good that when your child is born, he could be anything he or she wants to be. They could be the next Einstein, they could be the next Lionel Messi, they could be the next Michael Jordan. That's hopeful. Of course, it's complete nonsense, but it's hopeful. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel good to think, if I'm speaking as them now, not as me. It makes me feel hopeful as a parent to know that we are all born tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is the Latin word for empty slate. And it's only socialization that then makes me who I am. So if only my mother were to hug me enough or not hug me enough or give me McDonald's or not give me McDonald's, I could be the next Lionel Messi, right?
Is that like the nurture nature?
Exactly. And so there's something very hopeful about the fact that humans are only shaped by nurture, which of course is wrong. And so for all sorts of reasons, social scientists have developed their fields with a complete abdication of biology. So you could study economics, you could study sociology, you could study consumer behavior without ever mentioning the word biology in it, right? Now, for the other 1,999,999 species, you would never study the behavior of a salamander or a particular marsupial or a particular mammal without invoking their biological heritage. There's only one species where it is perfectly okay to never mention the word biology. It's called human beings. And so that was my first exposure to the lunacy that takes place on university campuses.
Okay, but so I always try to play devil's advocate.
Sure.
Or kind of steel manning any point we make. What is their argument? So when you speak to them,
yes,
let's say the most intelligent, logical one of them, when you speak to those professors, what do they say back when you make that point?
So several possible answers. One would be, I don't like the idea of you saying that humans are just genetic executors of their genes. That's called, by the way, biological determinism. So they like to feel as though human beings have degrees of freedom in their behavior. But that is actually true.
That can apply, yeah.
Exactly. So evolutionary psychologists believe in what's called the interactionist framework. Interactionist means that for almost all phenomena, it's an interaction between our genes and our environment. As a matter of fact, specific genes get turned on or off depending on certain environmental stimuli. But that shows you how imbecilic even very intelligent people can be. They have a completely erroneous view of what it means to study the evolutionary roots of human behavior. Here's another example. If you are, for example, a radical feminist and you're a professor, you don't like the idea that there are innate, evolved sex differences. Because in the view of that radical feminist, that makes it more difficult for me to eradicate the sexist status quo of the patriarchy. Therefore, I have to, in a complete hallucinatory manner, argue that any sex differences that arise must be simply due to socialization. The fact that Bubba can bench press, he's 6'4" and he plays as a center for University of Arkansas football team. The only reason why he bench presses more than 5'1" Linda is because he was taught how to play rough and tumble when he was a kid. So his parents condoned that behavior, whereas they taught little Linda to be nurturing and empathetic and kind. That's the only thing. So there are no physiological differences. There are no hormonal differences. There are no anatomical differences. There are no, right? It's insane. Now, by the way, those are the types of parasitic ideas that then allow people to completely jump off the abyss of infinite lunacy by saying, of course, boys can call themselves Linda tomorrow and play against girls. There are no sex differences between boys and girls, right? How is it that in the 21st century, we could have gotten to a place where the person who last went to the Supreme Court was a Biden appointee.
Okay.
One of the senators, when she was being confirmed, when the justice was being confirmed, it's a black lady. When she was being confirmed, one senator asked her, "Can you define what is a woman?" And I don't know if you saw it, Mario, but the justice who was going to be sitting on the Supreme Court said, "I'm unable to offer you a definition because I'm not a biologist." So now let's stop for a second. Until 15 minutes ago, the 117 billion people who have existed on Earth were completely able to navigate through the very, very difficult conundrum of knowing what is male or female. But the current sitting justice did not have the
Justice Jackson?
Justice Jackson, I think, yeah. Okay. And the one who was interviewing, I think, is Senator Marsha something.
Okay.
She didn't have the intellectual confidence to say, what kind of stupid question is that? Of course I could tell you what a woman is, because she had to equivocate, because now we lived in a world where it was no longer clear what is male, what is female. So all of these small attacks on the edifices of reason eventually result in the parasitic mind.
So essentially it's like a parasite, an anti-logic parasite.
It is.
Is that a good way to describe it? And it spreads like a parasite. So a parasite, and you've given a few examples in your book, but you've given one of that cricket that avoids the water, but when the parasite enters it and it starts jumping into the water, doing something that essentially harms it. And I've seen something similar on YouTube of another, other insects have a similar response to a parasite that infects them, and once it infects them, they start doing something that harms them.
Exactly, because it's a beautiful way to explain the neuroparasitological framework. So in nature, there are many host-parasite interactions. It's a beautiful field of study. Many parasites don't go to the brain. So for example, a tapeworm parasitizes your intestinal tract. Neuroparasites are the ones that need to get to the host's brain, altering its neuronal circuitry to suit its interests. So there is a evolutionary arms race between the host and the parasite. The parasite wants to alter the behavior of the host, even if it is suicidal. And the example you give is exactly the right one. The wood cricket abhors water. But when it is parasitized by the hairworm needs the wood cricket to go into water in order for it to complete its reproductive cycle. Therefore, once it is parasitized, it merrily jumps and commits suicide to the benefit of the parasite.
The argument you're making with the parasitic mind, essentially ideas could become like parasites.
Exactly.
They could spread like parasites, and they infect the brain in a very similar way, where they kind of force the brain to think in ways that go against reason, against logic. And in a way, the people like the Justice Jackson, they know the answer.
Exactly.
But it's like a parasite is in their mind that they cannot say the answer for some reason to feed the parasite itself.
Exactly. And I'll give you a beautiful example of a mixture of the parasitic mind and suicidal empathy. Okay. So there was a gentleman, Norwegian man, in I think 2013, who was raped by a Somali immigrant. He was sodomized by a Somali immigrant. Now, the way that our emotional system has evolved, you wouldn't typically be exhibiting great concern, compassion, and empathy towards the guy who sodomized you, right? That's just not part of our evolutionary makeup.
For obvious reasons.
For obvious reasons. Now, in this case, he was so both parasitized by actual idea pathogens and parasitized by suicidal empathy that after the Somali immigrant had served a very minimal sentence, because in Norway they're so kind and empathetic, it's not nice to punish criminals. After he served a minimal sentence and he was going to be deported back to Somalia, the guy who had been sodomized by him felt very, very bad and very guilty that now the Somali guy was not going to have a maximally flourishing life in Mogadishu, and he felt bad that it was because of his doing. So that's the perfect example of the utter, complete walking parasite, both in terms of his thoughts and in terms of his emotional system.
So the parasite led to suicidal empathy.
Exactly.
There's a lot of similar examples, by the way. There's a lot of people that were raped, and they feel bad for the rapist. And then they just cannot, because I've had these discussions before, when you ask them for a logical explanation, they just cannot make it. They just cannot do it. It's like, I don't know why, I just feel bad. That's like, that's more of the suicidal empathy. But your example links to the parasitic mind is because of the whole kind of movement, and we can get into the woke movement as well. I don't know how you started covering the woke movement. I'm still trying to understand it. That led to that parasite in their mind.
Yes. So the woke movement, I explained in the book, in the Parasitic Mind, stems really from a few key idea pathogens or parasitic ideas. The most important of which, the most dangerous of which, would be postmodernism. Postmodernism is the, quote, philosophical framework that allows for all of these other parasitic ideas to flourish. So what's postmodernism as a quick synopsis? Postmodernism basically argues that there are no objective truths. Of course, other than the one objective truth, that there are no objective truths. So already it shatters, but apparently we shouldn't notice that. So in a sense, that liberates you, right? It liberates me from my genitalia, because who am I to say if I'm male or female? What are chromosomes really? We don't know what that is. If I tomorrow decide that I'm Linda, shut up. I'm Linda and I box with girls, right? So postmodernism, I call it intellectual terrorism, because imagine how anti-scientific it is. Why? Because every day when I wake up and I'm trying to do a scientific study, I do think that there are truths to be discovered. Otherwise, there's no point in applying the scientific method. Now, here's a very important distinction. The fact that something is provisionally true in science doesn't mean that it is eternally true. That's why the word provisional is there. What we thought was true in science 300 years ago, we've updated our thinking. But we do think that epistemologically speaking, there are truths to be discovered. If you throw me off a 100-story building 100 times, I could tell you exactly 100 times what will happen to me. It's called gravity, right? So there are absolute truths. And yet I tell the story in the Parasitic Mind. This is the perfect story to captures what happens to a mind that is fully parasitized by postmodernism. And apologies to any of your viewers and listeners who've heard me say it before, because it's one of my favorite stories to tell, because it's so powerful. But we're a storytelling animal. I can give you all.
I'm excited to know which story it is.
Yeah, maybe you already know it. So in 2002, one of my former doctoral students had just defended his doctoral dissertation. And so we were going to go out. Does it ring a bell so far?
Not yet, no.
Not yet, okay. If it does, tell me. I know where you're going with this. If not, this is your first time hearing it and you'll enjoy it. So he says, let's go out. We agreed to go out and celebrate. And at the time, my wife and I didn't have children. It was myself, my wife, my doctoral student, with whom I recently had a Zoom chat. He's now a senior professor himself in Canada.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And he was bringing a date, a girl. And so he calls me up to kind of give me a heads up. He goes, I just want to tell you that the woman I'm bringing is a graduate student in women's studies, postmodernism, and cultural anthropology, to which I answered the holy trinity of bullshit. And so I said, okay, no, I got you. I'm going to be on my best behavior. This is your night. We're going to.
Are they still together?
No.
Okay.
He's married now. No. I should ask, though, how long it lasted after that evening. I don't think very long. So I said, oh, don't worry. I'm going to be on my best behavior, which, of course, was a complete lie, because about halfway through the evening, I turned to the lady and I said, oh, I hear you're a graduate student in postmodernism. Yes. Said, there are no objective truths. Yes? She goes, no. I said, okay, well, I'm an evolutionary scientist. So, for example, I think that there are features of human nature that are universal. It could be a Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon. It could be in Detroit, Michigan in 1950. It could be in 300 years from now in Malta. There are certain features that are absolute human universals. Do you mind if I propose what I think are some universals and then we can discuss them? She goes, yeah, go ahead. So now this is 2002. This is way before the transgender stuff, way before men can get pregnant and men can menstruate, 2002. I say, is it not true that within Homo sapiens, within humans, only women can bear children? So she looks at me. She can't believe what a moron I am. She goes, no, that's not true. I said, it's not true that only women bear children. How is that? She goes, well, there is some Japanese tribe off some Japanese island where within their mythological folkloric realm, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting it to the material realm, that's how you keep us barefoot and pregnant, you know, in the kitchen. So after I recovered from the mini stroke I had due to her stupidity, I said, okay, maybe it's too controversial for me to propose that only women bear children. Let me pick a less controversial example. Is it not true since time immemorial that sailors have relied on the following cosmological fact, that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? So here she used, Mario, a variant, a strand of postmodernism called deconstructionism. And the guy who founded this field is a French postmodernist called Jacques Derrida. And deconstructionism is basically language creates reality. There is no reality outside of language. So then she says to me, what do you mean by east and west? And what do you mean by the sun? That which you call the sun, I might call dancing hyena. Exact words. So I said, well, fine. The dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. She goes, I don't play those label games. Now, why do I always tell that story? Because I'm sitting with a person who supposedly is not an escapee from a psychiatric hospital, although you can't tell the difference because she's a graduate student in postmodernism. And I'm sitting and having an adult conversation with another person who's supposed to be intelligent, getting a graduate degree. Actually, it was in Montreal at one of the top universities in the world. And we couldn't agree on the fact that women bear children and that there is such a thing as east and west and the sun. Now, she wasn't some anomaly. She was exactly enunciating the words that you would learn if you paid $80,000 a year to go to Columbia to study postmodernism. So how could it be anything other than parasitic? What is the beneficial value that you will bring to society?
While you're talking, what I'm thinking about is that I always try to put myself in other people's shoes. I'm like, if I'm in her shoes, how is she interpreting what she's saying? I'm struggling to understand it. I'm struggling to understand how describing the sun as a dancing hyena. What's the purpose of that? And then not playing the labeling game. I just don't see the logic on her side.
It liberates you. So if, let's say you're an oncologist, you study cancer. All different cancers have different behaviors, but do they have anything in common? They do. It is the unchecked division of cells. So at the very least, whether it's leukemia or it's prostate cancer, at least we have that in common across the two cancers. So what I wanted to do is apply a similar mechanism to say, well, what is common across all these parasitic ideas, whether it be postmodernism or social constructivism or cultural relativism or biophobia? What's common across all these? And so I think I offered a reasonable answer, which is they all free us from the pesky shackles of reality, right? So transgender activism is wonderful once you couple it with radical feminism and with social constructivism, because it frees me from the shackles of my genitalia, right? Postmodernism frees me from everything. Up is down, left is right, freedom is slavery, war is peace, Hamas is freedom-loving, Jews are the Nazis. So I now have the epistemological weaponry to negate any form of reality. Boy, that's very liberating. It's wonderful. I'm not shackled by this thing called common sense, logic, reason, reality. And so that ultimately is the ultimate freeing of oneself. I mean, freeing in quotes.
So maybe the value of freeing oneself is being able to maybe do more. So if society limits, and I'm trying to play devil's advocate here. So obviously we see the negative impact this could have. You know, you need truths for society to exist, for humans to be able to function every day. We need to know those truths that, hey, if I get into the elevator, it'll take me down. And if I jump off from the balcony, it's quicker, but I'll be dead. You also see progress when people are not limited by certain beliefs, especially in cultures that limit freedom. So let's say, I'm struggling to play devil's advocate, but let's say I'm a woman and then there's certain societal expectations from a woman, but then trying to be more creative and moving away from reality, say, hey, I'm not bound by those laws, allows me to do more and allows me to achieve more. But then
I can help you with that.
Please, because I'm trying to give them credit as well for anyone that believes in postmodernism to say, look, I understand where you're coming from, even though we might disagree.
So, do you know, are you familiar with E.O. Wilson? Is that a name?
I'm not.
E.O. Wilson actually, regrettably, recently passed away. He's one of my intellectual heroes. He's a Harvard biologist. Specifically, his scientific work is in the study of social ants.
I think I know his quote. There's a famous quote of his, or no?
Probably you read it in my book.
Yes,
right?
yes, I think so.
So, okay, so I'll mention that
Please
quote.
do. It's a very good quote.
And then I will go back to what I was
the
going to say. So when they asked him his opinion on socialism / communism, he said, great idea, wrong species.
I remember, yes.
Right? Because ants are communistic. But by their evolutionary heritage, there is a reproductive queen, and then there is a whole caste of indistinguishable worker or warrior ants. They're all equal. Human beings are not ants because they're hierarchical. Some of us are taller, some of us are shorter, some of us are harder working, some of us play soccer like Lionel Messi, others don't. Some of us are intelligent like Einstein, others are not. So it doesn't make sense to impose a system on the human beings that is contrary to their human nature. Right? So that's the
That's
quote.
right. On that point as well, I relate to it so much because when I was a kid, I read about communism. I'm like, why does everyone hate communism? You know, it just makes a lot of sense. It's just such a...
We're all equal.
Exactly. We're all equal. It comes from such a kind place. And look, parasitic ideas come from a good place as well.
Exactly.
But then when you understand, we start to understand it further, understand how humans function, you're like, okay, it is a good idea, but it does not work in how we're built biologically.
Exactly. And so I'll give you one other point and I'll go back to E.O. Wilson. So one of the things that I talk about is any products, any policies, any political systems that are incongruent with human nature will ultimately fail. So let's apply it to consumer behavior. Okay. If you want to study the evolutionary preferences of women when it comes to mating, study the archetype of the male hero in romance novels, right? Every single romance novel that's ever been written in life is like a plagiarized one book.
It's the same man in all of them.
It's the same man. He is a prince. He's also a neurosurgeon. He's tall. He wrestles alligators on his six-pack. He can't be tamed unless it is the love of this one good woman. I just described every single romance novel that's ever been written. Okay, I'm being literal. Okay, so if I want to study what women fantasize over, just look at romance novels. Well, there was a company a few years ago, that decided, I mean, they didn't use the word woke, but they were progressive. They wanted to free themselves of the shackles of toxic masculinity. So they created a romance novel line where, this is now I'm using my Gad humor, they didn't do this, but sort of, where the man cries with his thumb in his mouth and while watching Bridget Jones' Diary, where he asks if he's too fat in his jeans, where he has a high pitchy voice because he's sensitive, because he's kind, because he's empathetic. Well, guess what the market answered to that new line of romance novels? It failed. Why did it fail? Because that product was contrary to an evolutionary feature of what women wanted. So one of the things that I teach my students when I'm, say, teaching MBA students, I tell them, what I'm going to teach you is not just how to be better business people. If I teach you the secrets to human nature, you could apply it anywhere you want. You could apply it to understand why your marriage is failing, why you want the corner office in the top floor, anything. You could apply it to all realms of life. So the audacity of a company to say, I will teach the consumer what they should like, right? And that comes from tabula rasa. We're all born empty slates, and it is me, the marketer, who will tell women what they should fantasize over. If I teach them in the romance novel to prefer the whiny, crying guy, then that's because I'm teaching them not to like toxic masculine guys. And women said, sorry, that doesn't trigger our fantasy juices, right? And so any context where you have a decoupling from something that you create and human nature is going to fail. That's why communism has been tried for 100 years in many, many different societies, and the answer is always the same. It's an abject failure. Okay, so now let's go back to E.O. Wilson. So to your point when you were saying, but are there some cases where E.O. Wilson, when they asked him about the interplay between genes and culture, he says, genes hold culture on a long leash, but it still has to be constrained by biological reality. What does that mean? So that's a fancy way of saying something maybe a bit easier to understand. Take, for example, the use of spices across cuisines. For example, in Mexico, they have hotter cuisine, spicier cuisine than in Sweden. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
So the question then becomes why? Why are some cuisines laden with spices and others are not? And I'm going to come back to your point. You're going to see I'm going to tie it up. Can you, by the way, guess at all why, evolutionarily speaking, some cuisines will evolve to be spicier than others?
I will not even try to guess this one.
Okay. So this is actually called the antimicrobial hypothesis. A cultural reality, in this case, how much spices I use in my cuisine, is a solution to a biological problem. The biological problem is that in cultures where it's hot climates, there is a greater density and proliferation of foodborne pathogens. One of the ways that you get rid of foodborne pathogens is via various cuisine approaches. Spice use, it's antimicrobial.
Mm-hmm.
Pickling, smoking the food,
Mm-hmm.
salting the food. So all of these adaptations, cultural adaptations, solve a biological problem. So now I come back
And
to
then it starts getting more creative from there. That's where the leash gets longer.
Exactly. So
that's a good example.
So it's okay for the leash to allow different lengths in different ecosystems, but it can't be completely decoupled from biology. The leash can go longer or shorter, but it's still constrained. What these parasitic ideas do is they say, no, there is no leash. We are infinitely malleable. We're not. I can guarantee you that I know a lot of babies, probably every baby ever born, because Lionel Messi is the greatest soccer player ever. No amount of nurturing that a parent does will result in you engineering a soccer player that is better than Lionel Messi. He was born with the exact set of tools that allowed him to be who he is. Had he been 6'4", he wouldn't. So when people say, "How tall are you, Professor?"
Same as Lionel Messi.
I usually say, "I'm tall enough to be like Lionel Messi. It's good enough for me." But had I been a basketball player, it would have been a problem, right? And so that answers, hopefully, your question.
It does. And what we're seeing right now is, I think that leash is getting a bit too long by the looks of it. And we've seen humans automatically, without realizing it, start pull it back.
Yes.
They start to realize that it's gone too long.
I think the recent election results are speaking to that.
Exactly.
People said, I've had enough of the decoupling of the leash.
A lot of people that might disagree with Trump or not like his personality just realize that it's no longer about a personality. But I think that just things have gotten to a level where they cannot be ignored anymore. And I think the transgender issue is one such example. I haven't covered it as much as I should have, because in my mind, I'm like, it sounds too crazy. So there must be something more to it. So either it's being taken way out of proportion and the issue is not that serious and it's being misrepresented in some ways, or there's another side of the argument that's not being made. So what I did before this interview, because I wanted to really, for once, explore that issue, is again, I called my team, Jess, and I'm like, Jess, be honest with me. Like, just not over-exaggerating. Let's not get political. Can men really play in women's sports? Is that really a thing? Or is there like a long process, and is how you define a man? Is some sports yes, some sports no? Is there certain requirements? And she goes, Mario, pretty much yeah. I'm like, I don't get it. Why would a man be able to play in women's sports? So I want to ask you those same questions. It's very, very basic, because a lot of people have heard about this issue and they've kind of ignored it. Like, look, let me worry about inflation. Let me worry about the economy. First, can men play in women's sports? Just a basic question, because I know you've researched it heavily.
No, lo. I just answered you no in Arabic, Hebrew, English, and French. It is an emphatic, unequivocal, unassailable no.
You say no, they shouldn't be able to.
They shouldn't be able to.
But they are doing it right now.
Oh, they are, but boy, Trump winning is going to change that.
So right now there's people that find it as a good idea for men, biological male. By the way, just so you know, I'm a person, just for the camera. If someone asks me to identify them whatever they want, I'm so open-minded. I believe in personal liberty.
By the way, me too.
Yeah, I know. I've heard you say it. So I don't mind what they want to do. But when it goes to that extreme where you have women that, work all their life to win the gold medal, that's all they do in their life, and then how they have to compete against someone born as a male, that's where, in my opinion, lines are being crossed. So what you're saying, just to understand it from someone that's obviously, you've discussed this issue at length, now Trump is president, we'll see how things change, but at the moment there's men competing against women.
As
in
a matter of fact, there
professional
was
sports.
a study that came out. I think maybe, I hope I'm not misspeaking, but it might have been through the rather woke United Nations umbrella that estimated that there were at least, I don't know at what level, but there were 900 medals that have been won by biological males in women's sports. Because oftentimes the really idiotic response that you get from the trans activists is, this is such a rare occurrence and it happens so infrequently. What are you getting all worked up about? By the way, even if there were only one medal that had been robbed from a woman, it would have been enough. Even if no medals had been robbed, there is something about adhering to truth, right? I mean, this is why in the opening chapter of The Parasitic Mind, I talk about my two foundational life ideals, which is truth and freedom, right? So even if not a single woman had been harmed through this lunacy, to me, it is still an affront to human reason, because we are a sexually dimorphic species. That's the fancy term, meaning that on average, men and women are not the same, certainly when it comes to physical strength. And as a matter of fact, you could look at very objective metrics in, say, track and field, in every possible sport that you could think of, and it's not even close what, say, the top men are to the top women. But suddenly, through the parasitic idea of transgenderism, by the way, when I say this, I don't mean to imply that there is no such thing as people who are confused about their gender.
Gender dysphoria.
Gender dysphoria. And until very recently, if you, let's say, wanted to go through the sex reassignment procedure until, say, 15 minutes ago when this transgender stuff went wild, there was a very, very rigorous psychiatric process you had to go through for years before you were then eventually sexually reassigned. Well, now we've removed all that. Monday morning, I'm a 6'4" male who has competed as a male in U.S. college competitions in swimming. Tuesday, Linda, that's it, shut up. Do not question my identity. That's insane. But it comes again from this reflex of being empathetic. But you're actually not being empathetic, because in the service of being empathetic to 1 out of 10,000 people who truly do have gender dysphoria, you are being non-empathetic to all of the biological females who have now lost their place on the podium.
Yes, I think, and it goes back to the way you've compared it to a parasite, because you said it starts with a few, and it starts from well-intentioned people.
Exactly.
If you want to help people that have gender dysphoria, I'm all for it. I think people should be educated, and even if it's 0.0001% of the population, that's tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, and they should be, given the attention they deserve. Every life is equal. So it starts from a good place.
Exactly right.
And then the leash gets longer and longer
until it breaks.
And it starts impacting others. You're helping 0.001%
and harming everybody else.
Exactly.
And actually, so in 2017, Mario, I was summoned to appear in front of the Canadian Senate with Jordan Peterson.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I've had him on the show. Incredible, man.
Okay, yeah, we're good friends. He's a fellow Canadian. People ask us, what's in the Canadian water that we have some of the biggest freedom fighters? I don't know.
And weird jackets. He has 2-color jackets, and you have the professor jacket.
There you go. By the way, the company that created what you're calling weird jacket recently reached out to me and did pro bono, because I've always wanted to have a red velvet suit. They did one for me, and about 2 months ago, I picked it up. And maybe I should have worn it today here. I haven't yet premiered it.
You should do a photo with it, and we'll put it as a thumbnail of the video.
I do have it. I'll send that to you. I'll send it to you. Okay. So both Jordan and I had appeared separately in front of the Canadian Senate. At the time, there was a discussion about a bill called Bill C-16, which was trying to incorporate gender identity and gender orientation under the rubric of hate speech and hate laws. And so I went up in front of you can watch it. I have it on my channel. Okay. You could watch my testimony. And I'm summarizing here. I said, look, I'm all for all people living dignified lives free of institutional bigotry. That's great. But in the service of doing that, you don't get to murder and rape truth. And you don't get to ask me to celebrate your unique personhood, right? So, and let me give you a specific example. Did you notice recently that I call her occasional cortex, but AOC very quietly in the darkness of the night when nobody's looking. Did you see what she changed in her bio? You didn't see that, Mario?
No.
There's no longer any pronouns in her bio.
Really?
How come until the transgender pronoun craze came along, you never had? The first 35 years of your life, it seemed as though we could all recognize that you were female. But then for the next 2-3 years of woke orgies, we had to all put our pronouns, not we, I didn't, but many people did. And then now when it looks like the ecosystem is shifting,
The leash is getting shorter.
the leash is getting shorter without anybody looking. Listen, if gender pronouns are a good idea, they should be a good idea forevermore. You should never take them off. This demonstrates the hypocrisy and the performative nature of what she and every other person who tried to force others to put gender By the way, I think it's called Zubi's maxim. Zubi, do you know who Zubi is? He's
The podcaster.
the podcaster.
Yeah, I was with him last week.
Okay, so he's got this thing where how woke. I can't remember what his maxim is, but basically
He did win in the competition as a
woman. Exactly.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he basically argues, and I completely support that position. I've argued the same thing, that I could pretty much ignore anything that you have to say as a function of whether there are gender pronouns in your bio or not, because it's such a silly thing. I mean, imagine that a sexually reproducing species, right? So when I went in front of the Canadian Senate, I said, no, I'm here to tell you as a chaired professor that there is such a thing as male and female. Do we really need to do that in the 21st century? Well, apparently we did.
So I let me know, and I'd love you to disagree as well. I think if someone wants to have gender pronouns, it's their prerogative, and if it's for the sake of inclusion, probably not the best way to apply inclusion. But hey, you're doing the right thing. I think where the line for me is crossed is when it goes into free speech, which is something similar to you. I'm a free speech absolutist,
Yes,
which we can dig into as well. I think that forcing others to use a certain gender and to use a certain pronoun, that's where, in my opinion, the line is crossed. If you want to be, if someone wants someone to address you as they, them, or whatever other pronoun, I think there's too many, I forgot them all now. That's fine. It's your prerogative. Forcing someone else to say it and legally forcing them to say it, considering it hate speech, which is one of the most concerning labels that's been created in the last few years, is too fine. And I would love to get your thoughts on this. And if you disagree with my stance that if someone wants to have the pronouns, that's fine as long as you don't force them onto others. And then kind of link it into the importance of free speech, because I think what you and Jordan Peterson were fighting for, beyond the whole woke mind virus, is the importance of free speech.
Yes, sir. So I agree. You want to put your pronouns, go for it. Live and let live. So I'm 100% with you, so I don't disagree. So let me begin by explaining how much of a free speech absolutist I am. And you may have heard me mention this example before. I'm Jewish, very strong Jewish heritage with very difficult upbringing in Lebanon. I'm, very much a supporter of Jews being allowed to exist and not be exterminated.
It's not too much to ask.
It's not too much to ask.
Can you, before going to free speech absolutism, your story is a fascinating one.
Okay, you want me to do that before we do free speech?
I'd love it, exactly, because I think that played a role in getting you where you are today. Your
100%.
background is very similar to what you're fighting for now.
Which speaks to nurture, right? There is a part of me
Exactly.
that's just, I'm innately who I am, but then I'm shaped also by the unique life experiences that I've experienced, right? So I was born in Lebanon. We were part of the last remaining very, very small and dwindling Jewish community in Lebanon. At its maximum point, there were several thousand, I think maybe up to 10, 15,000 Jews in Lebanon.
Before the Civil War?
Before the Civil War. But in the 20th century. But then throughout the 20th century, it became a lot more difficult to be Jewish in the Middle East, in Arab countries. And so most of my extended family, grandparents, uncles, aunts had all left Lebanon.
They left. Just a quick question on that point. How was it before World War II, like in the early days? Because when Lebanon was considered I think it was Paris or Middle East. What percentage were Jewish, do you know?
Very, very little. 5 to 10,000 at most.
Oh, wow. Okay,
Yeah.
never too many.
Never too many. As a matter of fact, so Lebanon has what's called a confessional system in the parliament, meaning that you get seats assigned in parliament as a function of your religion.
Religion, yeah.
And so Jews have...
Religion and sect within a religion, yeah.
And so, for example, a president has to always be this, prime minister
Christian,
has to be that, the speaker of the house has to be this. So it's Shia, Christian Maronite.
Yeah, Christian is the
and
president
Sunni.
because I've interviewed some of them for the war. Christian is the president, prime minister, Sunni Muslim,
Sunni
and then the
speaker is Shia.
Shia. Yes,
Exactly.
Yes. But was there any representation from Jewish?
Yes, there was one seat from
Oh,
the
wow,
Jewish
okay.
community. Okay, so in that sense, Mario, it's tolerant, but it's tolerant. In French, you say entre guillemets, like with the
Inverted
apostrophe.
commas,
Right.
apostrophes. Yeah.
Because it's tolerant in the Middle Eastern sense. We tolerate you, and we reserve the right at any point to stop tolerating you. And when we stop tolerating you, you better put on really good running shoes and run really fast because we're coming for you.
And that's what happened.
And
with
that's
your
what
family.
happened to us. So my immediate family, my nuclear family, so my parents and we're 4 kids, had stayed in Lebanon, but the writing was on the wall even before the civil war started. So for example, one of my brothers who was a big judo champion, he's the next oldest, he's 10 years older than me.
He's the one in the club that always went after the women and did really well.
Look at you having done
It's
your homework.
him, yeah?
That's him. That's him. He's the guy who was very wealthy in Southern California. So he was Lebanese champion for several years in a row. And it's not very nice when a Jewish guy is winning and making the rest of us look bad. So he was visited by some men who explained to him that it was time for him to retire, lest there might be an accident that happens to him. So he realized that that was the end of his judo career in Lebanon. So he ended up moving to Paris in France. The French have historically had a very good tradition in judo to pursue his studies and his judo career before the Civil War. The Civil War hadn't broken out, but it was already starting to get bad. Then my other brother, who's the eldest, who's almost 14 years older than me, had married a Lebanese Christian girl, which already was terribly traumatic both to her family and to my family.
Wouldn't she need to convert to Judaism?
Well, technically, yes, but what they ended up doing is what used to happen in Lebanon is you couldn't get married interfaith because, let's say, the church wouldn't allow it, and so what people would do, they would elope to Cyprus to get married. And that's what
even back then.
So my ex-sister-in-law, who unfortunately recently passed away, she was Palestinian Christian.
Wow.
Okay. So anyways, so one day they were stopped at a roadblock by PLO fighters, Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Yasser Arafat guys from back in the day. And they stopped them. And as often happens in these countries, they look at his watch and say, "Oh, that's a really nice watch you're wearing," which basically means fork it over. He says, "I'm not giving you this watch. It's my mother just gave it to me."
That's your brother?
That's my eldest brother.
Okay.
And so then they look and say, "Oh, that's a beautiful blonde wife you have there," which basically means time to make a choice. You want to keep the wife or you want to keep the watch? So then they moved from Lebanon and they
Did he
came
give
to
the watch?
Montreal. I think that he gave away the watch. They moved here in 1974. So
Just
this is
before the war.
Just before the war. And then my sister, who's 12 years older than me, also moved to Montreal prior to the start of the Civil War. So there were very few of us left, and then the war broke out. So once the war broke out, all bets were off.
All hell broke loose.
Then you really couldn't be Jewish, and it was, your hair is on fire. You have to leave. So people say, okay, but before the Civil War, how was it being Jewish? I said, well, look, it's not as though every day somebody was coming to hunt you down, because obviously if people want to find out you're Jewish, they just have to go Saturday when you go to the synagogue and they'll see that you're Jewish. So it's not as though it was a complete abject secret that you were Jewish, but you certainly didn't advertise it. Don't trigger us. Don't wear a big Star of David, right? So I tell a few stories that kind of give you a sense of what it was to be in the Paris of the Middle East as a Jew. In 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, who was very revered across the Arab world because he was a pan-Arabist, meaning he was trying to unite all of the Arab countries into one unit. We have to get rid of those pesky Jews. We have to be one common group. Well, when he passed away in 1970, as often happens in the Middle East, people take to the street with fervor. Actually, the Arabic word for fervor is Hamas. People don't know this, right? Hamas, with fervor, right? So they go to the street and they do lamentations and they scream to God and they do all kinds of protests, right? Well, as they were proceeding down our street to lament the fact that the Egyptian president had just died, the chant was, "Death to Jews, death to Jews." I'm 5 years old. I was almost
Do you remember
6.
any of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Wow.
how am I saying the story? Of course.
No, maybe
Yeah, this is from my memory. And I
wow.
remember I was kind of looking up from the balcony, and my mother says, just keep. I said, well, why are you screaming death to Jews? What do we have to do with this? So that was my first conscious memory of having seen hatred towards the Jews. So that's one. Story 2, maybe about a year before the Civil War, we're in class, and the teacher says, each of you get up, stand up, and tell us what you want to be when you grow up. I want to be a soccer player. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a policeman. One of the kids gets up, says, when I grow up, I want to be a Jew killer. To raucous laughter and applause. Well, that, by the way, I have, you know those class photos that you have where you're all standing? I've got the class photos
With the student.
with that student.
Have you tried reaching out to him?
I've never reached out to
You
him.
should.
I've never even said his name out of some sort of honor code that I don't want to, point to who he is.
You should. What I think you should do is honestly try to find him and just do an interview with him. It might go really bad, or it might end up changing complete mindset change. But it's just
That's a cool.
It'd be fascinating.
That
to
would be
do.
cool to do.
But sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt the story.
So, well, I'll tell you, it might be tough to go back to a kid from 1974 and track him, although I'm sure I probably could if he's still alive. I'm not that old. But there is a more recent story of anti-Semitism where I think I could reach that guy. I'll tell that story, but that's not Lebanon. But it's a side parenthesis. Can we go there for a second?
Please.
First semester as a doctoral student at Cornell,
What year was that?
1990.
Okay.
So I did an undergrad and MBA here. Now I'm going to do my Master's of Science and PhD at Cornell. First semester, I connect with some Lebanese guys, because I'm Lebanese, and we're always hanging around and playing soccer and so on. And actually, the guy who connected was my conduit to that community of guys there. I don't think he minds if I mention his name. His name is Karim Talib, who is the cousin of Nassim Talib. I don't know if you know Nassim Talib is a very famous author, Lebanese author.
Anti-fragile.
Anti-fragile, Fooled by Randomness, and so on. So Karim was studying at Cornell, and through a Lebanese friend here who told me to reach out to him there, that's how I connected with
Nassim Talib is also Lebanese.
Nassim Talib is also Lebanese,
Okay.
absolutely. And he's actually come to visit me in Montreal before.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he's a good guy. Can be fiery at times, but he's a good guy. So I get to know all these guys. We're playing soccer. All is well. Maybe about 2 months into my first semester at Cornell, one of those guys, Muslim Lebanese guy, invites me out for a coffee. We go out. You know the story?
Yes, I remember it now. Yeah.
Do you remember what the title of that story is?
No, I don't remember the title, but it's
Okay.
saying, I know you're a Jew, but you're not like the other Jews.
Something like, well, the story is called the Jew story.
Yes.
So we go out. The first thing he says to me, which usually I don't tell that part of the story, but I'll give you that special exclusive here. First he says, Gad, you're a very bright guy. Why haven't you converted to Islam yet? I'm like, if this is the point of you inviting me for a coffee, this is not going to go well. So then he kind of moves away from that. Then he looks at me, he goes, Gad, I really like you. I said, why do you say that as though it's surprising? Oh, I know. I'm not going to say his name out of respect. Oh, it's because I'm Jewish. He goes, no, come on. But I mean, you're not a Jew. I said, no, I'm a Jew. But the point of that story that I tell is because the only way he could reconcile him having positive feelings towards me is to negate that I'm really what he despises. I'm not a real Jew. That's why he can like me.
Is that him? Is that the cognitive dissonance kind of a fight with his parasites? There's a parasitic belief that a hatred against any religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any other, essentially it becomes a parasite that's embedded in your brain since you're a kid. And
absolutely,
as you grow old, you realize, hold on, that's not really true. This Jewish person or Muslim person, they're just like me. Exactly. But that's not what I was taught as a kid. And then you start fighting that parasite.
Exactly. And by the way, the guy who developed the theory of cognitive dissonance is Leon Festinger, who's a brilliant guy. People should go back and read him from the 50s and 60s. His insights into the types of cognitive machinations that people do to resolve their internal inconsistencies. So the way he resolved it is he removes the true marker of being Jewish. You're not a Jew. But I've always thought, I'm quite in the public eye. I would love for him to one day write to me and say, I heard that story you shared
I'd love,
about
what,
me.
I'll get his details afterwards, and I'll reach out and write to him and maybe do a show on it, because I'd be first we'll see where he's at now mentally, but also be very interesting, especially in the current state of things, and then be fascinating to get his take on it and what he remembers from that day. And then, so I love the story, and then that was linking to your story. The reason I'm really digging into your Lebanon story, because it kind of led to who you are today and a lot of what you're talking about today. And it is also a fascinating story. So, most of your family left by the 70s. Your parents left. Did they ever come back?
Yes.
Well?
So we moved here end of 75. So
to Montreal.
To Montreal. So we go through the first year of the Civil War. We get here. My parents, they're already, not old, but so this is 1975. So my mother is 41. My father is 45, I guess. He's born in 1930. She's born in 1934. So they're already almost middle-aged. They're Lebanese. So I'll tell you a quick story about how difficult it was for them to acculturate to Canada. So the first month or two, my father kept receiving parking ticket somewhere, okay, where he would park. And so at one point, he turns around to whomever and says, well, who's the cop that I have to speak to get this thing resolved? Which in the Lebanese context, it's all in Arabic. Wasta is like connections.
Connections, yeah.
Right? And so the person who he says that to says, well, that's not how it works here. And he goes, what kind of barbaric society is this? So from his point of view, it was barbaric that you can't.
Exactly.
This is
the laws are barbaric.
The laws are barbaric.
Corruption is good.
Corruption is the natural. Bakshish, a bit of this, a bit of that.
Did they ever come back to the country during the war?
No, so that I'm going to come to that.
Okay.
So 75, we move here. They have a hard time. They try to open a store here. We lost everything. We had nothing, right? And we were well off over there, connected, the whole thing. And it doesn't go well here. So they start going back to Lebanon in the full-blown civil war. And so from about age 11 to 15, 16, for long, long periods, I was parentless.
Did you go back with them or no?
No, I never went back. Okay. The only ones who went back were my parents. In 1980, so on one of their return trips to Lebanon, they were kidnapped by Fatah. And some really bad things happened to them. But luckily, I say we, but I had nothing to do with it. I was 15 years old. But my brothers and sister and their connections were able to get them free. Actually, that story is interesting if you want to hear it. So my mother's best friend at the time, her name was Ihsan. She was a Syrian woman. From Damascus to Beirut, it's like a 2.5-hour drive. So you go back and forth. And actually, some of my immediate ancestors are also Syrian. So my mother's best friend was Ihsan, who used to be the personal dresser of Hafiz al-Assad.
The dictator in Syria.
But the father, not the current, not
Bashar al-Assad.
Exactly.
His father, which was apparently, was he stricter? No,
Hafiz. Well,
I don't know the history too well,
yeah.
but I know that a lot of people are pretty critical of him.
So they reach out to her. She gets the network stuff going. Finally, as the story goes, they reach Yasser Arafat, who tells them, I don't even know if my parents are with any of our groups. I can find out, but I hope they're not with Abu Nidal's group, because they were having a power fight between Fatah's group, which was led by Abu Nidal, and Yasser Arafat.
Two Palestinian groups fighting.
Yeah, and it turns out that my parents.
And then we don't know which one kidnapped your parents.
It was the Fatah, the Abu
Fatah,
Nidal group.
and then if the other group kidnapped him, it was worse.
No, that group was bad because it would give less leeway to Yasser Arafat to intervene with them. Anyways.
I got it. Yes, so they had connections essentially to Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of Fatah.
No, who was the leader of the PLO.
The PLO, okay.
Yeah, Fatah has another Palestinian group.
Opposing them.
Yeah.
Okay. And then he didn't have the connection to get him out.
So he didn't. That would have been the worst outcome, but we still did get them out. They only ended up spending about 8 days in captivity. And
that's a lot.
Some really, really bad stuff. Really, 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 very bad. That's why I get very upset when people whine about their bullshit victimhood, because it'd be difficult to outrank the life that I've lived and what my family's lived. I mean, literally. Luckily, we were able to get them out. But now here's an interesting side story. I think I mentioned this in the Parasitic Mind, this particular snippet. as they were in captivity and there was a lot of tension in the house. I could see my brothers speaking. I said, well, what's going on? They said, oh, mom and dad lost some money. They didn't want to tell me what the real story was to protect me. So I was going to school every day during those 8 days, not knowing that my parents have disappeared. But there was a guy in my high school who his parents were very good friends with my parents. They're also Lebanese Jews, who knew that they had disappeared, but who didn't know that I didn't know that they had disappeared. Are you with me so far?
Yes, of course.
And so later, after the fact, he told me that, it's good that I found out that you didn't know, because I thought it was very sinister how you were carrying about, laughing, and it looked like you were perfectly normal. And I was surprised that you would be so happy when nobody knew where your parents were.
Because you didn't know.
I didn't know.
And then you thought you're like some
like psychopath who doesn't
psychopathic.
care, like who's completely callous.
The opposite of being an empathetic person.
Exactly. And so anyway, luckily they were freed, came here. My father, when they were freed, had in Arabic you say falij. Falij is like a paralysis. It's like a stroke where your face becomes asymmetric. He had that out of the stuff that had happened to him in there, and he had some bad stuff. And they're still alive, and they're 94 and 90 today.
They never went back to Lebanon after that event, I guess.
After that, not a single person went back, although I've been invited. Actually, it's funny that the driver who picked me up to bring me here, he turns out to be Lebanese and a fan. And so he asked me if I went back, and I've been invited many times to go back, like high profile stuff. Oh, don't worry, you'll be protected. I never felt that it was a good idea. And I think life has shown that my evaluation was right.
When were you invited?
The last time would have been when Hariri,
Prime Minister, got assassinated?
Yeah, it was around that time. So whenever that would have been the last time I was invited. It was oh, come, give a great talk. You'll be protected. You'll have the whole. But car bomb doesn't care.
Yeah.
And plus, it just takes one guy who saw me say something that was critical of Islam, and I'm dead, right?
Yeah, yeah. So how big of a role did that play in the career path you've chosen that led you here?
That's a fantastic question. So in the most direct way, it's the disdain for identity politics, because Lebanon is the perfect model of what happens to a society that is completely organized. To our earlier point about the confessional parliamentary system, everything is viewed through the prism of your religious.
Parasites are embedded into the country.
Exactly. And it's coalitional psychology parasites, right? It's red team, blue team.
Yeah.
Now, to some extent, the human architecture views the world through red team, blue team, right? I mean, it makes sense for us to view the world as these are the people that I know and I trust, and these are the outsiders that I have to be weary of. So to a small degree, it makes evolutionary sense for us to have a coalitional psychology. But when you elevate that to be the mechanism by which you adjudicate everything in society, then you're going to have problems. So I'll give you a specific example of that. In Lebanon, you used to carry, in Arabic, the word is hawiya. Hawiya is like an internal ID card, like a passport, but instead of it be to travel outside, if the police stops you or a militia group stops you, show us your hawiya. The most conspicuous thing in your hawiya, what do you think it is? Your religion.
They have your religion on there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, if you were Jewish, so in Arabic, Jewish would be Yehudi. But it wasn't written that. It was written Israeli. Israeli means Israelite. So you lost your Lebanese identity. So the animus was even greater.
When did that change?
As far as I know, it never changed. Like the Jews in the Hawiye were always written as Israeli. But that literally means Israeli.
You're not Lebanese.
But I'm not Lebanese.
Exactly.
So now
it's like if you're a Christian there, it's like it's not a Christian country, but it's Italian or Roman.
Well, although, by the way, Lebanon, even within my lifetime, was a Christian majority country.
Yeah, majority. Was it 50-50 or?
No, at one point it was slight majority, like say 60-40 Christian.
And then it flipped after during the Civil War gradually.
And now it's about 1/3 Christian. So within 40 plus years, it has completely flipped. So it doesn't take long for demographic realities to completely shift.
So what led us to this story is our positions on free speech.
Yes, sir.
And I think we both considered oneself as free speech absolutists. How would you define a free speech absolutist and make the argument for that position? Because it's one that many people struggle to agree with, considering the risks that come with free speech.
Fantastic question. Arguably one of the most important questions that we can discuss. So here I'm going to get professorial for a second, then I'm going to give examples that are more tangible. So in ethics, there are distinction between two types of ethical positions. There's what's called deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics. Deontological ethics are absolute statements. It is never okay to lie. That would be a deontological statement. If I say it's okay to lie to spare someone's feelings, that's a consequentialist position, because I'm saying based on the consequences of what I say will determine whether it's a moral thing to do or not. So I always joke that if you want to be married for a long time, if you hear the following question, do I look fat in those jeans? Put on your consequentialist hat, right? In other words, even if you lie and you say, no, sweetie, you've never looked more beautiful, that makes sense. So for most things in life, it makes perfect sense for us to be consequentialist. But now I'm going to tie it to your question. There are certain principles that by definition have to be deontological.
Or absolutist.
They're absolutist. The pursuit of truth is a deontological principle. It's not, I will pursue truth as long as that truth doesn't end up hurting someone's feelings. So for example, if I find out that there is a particular group of immigrants that are much more likely to be in the penal system throughout Europe, and the data couldn't be any more incontrovertible. If I am suicidally empathetic, I say, don't publish that because you're going to marginalize those noble people even more. If you are a deontological guy in your pursuit of truth, you go, no, no, no. I don't modulate what the truth is as a function of whether it will hurt someone's feelings or not. Freedom of speech is a deontological principle. If
it's an absolutist right that should not be questioned.
Short of the regular asterisk, I can't engage in incitement to violence. I know that Mario is coming out of the synagogue on 7th and Broadway at 4. Let's all go and kill him. That's not protected by freedom of speech. And
that's a direct incitement of violence.
Direct incitement, right?
And the key word here is direct, so it doesn't get abused.
Exactly. Very direct. There is no question. On 7th and Broadway at 4 o'clock, get the Jew.
So if someone says, screw the Jews, then that's not a direct incitement of violence. That's someone that hates Jews. You could disagree with them, or you even said you're even okay with people that deny the existence of the Holocaust,
that's the tangible example I was going to give.
It's a very personal example for you to make.
You could not say anything that is more insulting and offensive by definition. You're taking a historical event that's been documented in 33 trillion ways, and you're saying it never happened. And this event was the systematic attempt to exterminate an entire people. Not a single Jew should remain in order for the world to be free. And yet, nothing could be more offensive than you saying it never happened. And if it did, it was only 6 Jews, right? That's very offensive. In a free society, I have to tolerate that. I have to tolerate falsehood spreaders, imbeciles, racists, bigots. And the way I beat you is hopefully by better ideas, right? By the way, I get people who write to me, even people in influential Jewish organizations, and say, how come you don't tell your buddy Elon Musk to shut down this account and that account and see, look, I walk the walk and talk. I say, no, because I don't believe that it is my job to reach out to Elon to shut those guys down. As long as they don't advertise where I am teaching my next course and for them to come and lynch me, they could say all kinds of horrible things to me. It's bad. It's regrettable. Sometimes it hurts my feelings, but that's the price you pay. So let's contrast what I just said to violations of deontological principles. So now I'm going to be one of those guys that violates it. Of course, I believe in freedom of speech, but it was perfectly okay to shut down Donald Trump because he's an existential threat. Once you say that, you're an asshole. You're a degenerate. You don't understand what freedom of speech is, right? Of course, I believe in presumption of innocence, but not for that asshole Brett Kavanaugh. It was too important for him to get a pass and sit on the Supreme Court, even though there was no proof that he was a sexual assaulter. It was enough for someone 5 minutes before he's confirmed to say, I think 40 years ago, somewhere, somehow, he did assault me. I don't have any proof, but we should go with the default position that he is guilty. Forget about this presumption of innocence, right? Yes, I believe in journalistic integrity, but not when it came to Hunter Biden's laptop. In that case, it was perfectly okay for everybody to collude to shut down that story, because then Orange Himmler would have come to power.
You've just given great examples on why absolute truths matter, and consequential ones, or I'll say malleable ones, also play a role. The example you've given is when to lie. There's times when lying does matter. Hey, talking about Jews and how they've been targeted, and talking about the Holocaust. There's that great movie, World War II movie, where someone was hiding Jewish people under the ground. You remember that one?
Of course.
You know which movie I'm talking about.
Inglorious Bastards.
Exactly. And he had to lie that initially he lied that they were when he's hiding them, but obviously for a very good cause. And there's a very good quote I've always used. It's by Voltaire. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Exactly. It's an incredible quote.
Beautiful.
And you mentioned Elon, and I know you've spent time with Elon as well.
Yep.
You know him really well. And you said something in one of the podcasts that was really interesting. Elon's achieved a lot to society, a lot. And he keeps achieving more as time passes. He doesn't stop. From getting us to start living as a species onto another planet for the first time, to being part of the creation of AI, which I wanted to talk about as well. We won't have time today, but maybe we should do it again.
Sure.
We're talking about the issues you're talking about, parasitic mind and suicidal empathy, especially parasitic mind. Parasites within an intelligence that we could lose control of is scary as hell. That's something that I want to really explode. But you said that nothing, I'm going to read out your exact quote. That's the only quote
I think I know which quote it is.
And I'm sure you do. You said the following. You said, nothing Elon has done or will ever do will have the same historical impact as him buying Twitter. That's a pretty big statement, considering how much he's achieved. Can you expand on that?
Well, I said that well before we saw the influence that he's had in the current election.
Sure.
Right?
Well, and before the rocket was being caught by these chopsticks as well.
But even such an impressive, I mean, you think it's science fiction. What the hell's going on here, right? I stand by that quote. Look, freedom of speech, I mean, it sounds cliche at this point, but it's the whole game. It's the whole enchilada. Once you get rid of that, nothing else matters, right? I mean, Salman Rushdie has said something very similar. Do you know who Salman Rushdie is? He's an ex-Muslim who in the 80s wrote a novel called The Satanic Verses, and the Iranian regime, Khomeini, had put out a death fatwa on him. And recently, after like 35 years of that fatwa, a guy knifed him in the eye.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think he's been knighted, by the way. Salman Rushdie's been knighted. He's Sir Salman Rushdie. I quote him in The Parasitic Mind that nothing is as important as freedom of speech. So when Elon said, hey, look, I can tip the weight of the scale so that it's a bit more of a fair and even game, right? Because most of the platforms all the platforms were utterly run by wokesters. And suddenly here comes the richest, most influential guy in the world who says, wait, I'm going to redress the balance. I mean, I could tell you, it's as if I had a 1,000-pound gorilla lifted off my shoulders, because suddenly I could say things on social media. I mean, I always said whatever I wanted, but I knew that I would get my voice shut down, or this clip demonetized, or this taken off.
And that could always have some impact, to some extent, on decisions you make.
And I tell you one that I'm ashamed to admit did happen, but I'll mention it here because it's important to be honest. I remember Matt Ridley, who's a famous evolutionary biologist. He sat in the House of Lords in the British Parliament. He'd been on my show a few times, and his people reached out to me. They had him and a co-author had a book out talking about the lab leak theory of COVID early in the process. And so I wrote back to his people. I said, look, there is no topic that I'm not willing to cover, and I'm perfectly happy to host you. But here's what's going to happen. We're going to spend the time doing this show. The minute that I'm going to post it, it's going to be taken out, and possibly my whole channel will be erased. So pragmatically speaking, it's reckless and silly to do. But that never sat well with me, because that demonstrated that they got to me. Even the honey badger had to calculate that, pragmatically speaking, if we do have this conversation, I'm going to be rendered invisible. And so, willfully or not, we all had to calculate the pros and cons of anything we said or did. And then here comes Elon on his white horse saving our freedom of speech. So I stand by that quote and I double down on it. Nothing he will ever do will be as important as that. He's a hero for that. He deserves the Nobel Prize for that.
And instead, he got targeted by advertisers, all these different organizations
Who
in the
are all
Biden
coming back.
administration. And now it's backfiring. Every decision he makes, I'm like, what are you doing, Elon? Like, for example, going all in on Trump, and before Trump got elected by a landslide. I remember he was on Tucker's show, and he says, Tucker asked him, like, do you know what's going to happen to you if Trump loses? He's like, I'm fucked.
I'm done.
Exactly, and I could end up in jail. And laughs about it. And I'm like, this is terrifying. And yet it paid off in an incredible way for him, for obviously President Trump, and for society as a whole. But it's an interesting statement to make, and I think people don't understand. It's like we're sleepwalking into censorship, not knowing the costs of censorship, the costs of the amount of impact it could have on society as a whole, and giving control to a very small number of people on speech as a whole. And when you give control of speech, you give control to IDs to a small group of people. And we saw what happens when a small group of people have control of IDs. The leash gets way too long and things get out of control. So people don't see that effect, whereas like a small domino, small censoring one issue because a bigger issue. It works. Like during COVID, it worked. Bigger issue, and the dominoes continue falling until you've just got a society crumbling because of what could be innocent censorship because of good intentions.
Exactly.
I think there's just so much more to discuss. Obviously, I wanted to really dig into Donald Trump's election results. I think that's a fascinating story, and I think what impact it would have on the parasitic minds or suicidal empathy we're seeing in the US right now.
Well, what I can tell you, forgive me for interrupting, and then
No,
I know you
please,
want to wrap it up. I've been very, very keen to warn people that they shouldn't be complacent in their fight against the parasitic mind and suicidal empathy now that Donald Trump is coming in. It's good. It's reversing the trend. The fulcrum is switching. There's an autocorrection taking place. But it took, Mario, 50 to 100 years for these ideas to proliferate, originally from university campuses into every nook and cranny of society. Now, I'd like to think that it won't take 50 to 100 years to get rid of them, but it's not going to be Donald Trump comes in, woke stuff is gone. So we have to stay vigilant. We have to keep talking. We have to keep having these conversations. And inshallah, in 20, 25 years, this will be part of the dustbin of history.
And I think this is already happening. I think Trump will trigger these discussions. He's really good at making things that seem taboo no longer be taboo.
Yeah.
It's really taboo to question mainstream media.
Yes.
It was one of the things I disliked the most about Trump. I'm like, the importance of the freedom of press is paramount.
Yes.
You cannot attack the press this way. But then when you understand the press is more
biased.
Exactly. So biased and corrupt in many ways. The system is so corrupt. They're like, hold on, Trump has a point. And now it became normal to question the press. But Doctor, I think we should do this again, as there's so many more points
Anytime.
to discuss. Especially another one I really was keen on having a chat with. I was talking to my girlfriend about is all these different points and the way you've linked parasitic. There's two different theories, the parasitic mind and suicide, especially suicidal empathy, and the impact they have on relationships. You have some incredible stories there that I want to, for selfish reasons, ask about. I think I'll be more interested in the audience to understand them. So we should do this again, but it's been an incredible pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much
to be
for
on
your
the other
pleasure.
side of the mic. And
I'm going to put you right now as in the top few hosts, just like I did for the Diary CEO guy.
I appreciate it. Thank you for that. It's very kind of you.
Thank you.
you, Doctor.
Cheers. Thank you.